Hello, my name is Phil Gaglio and I'm president of the George Washington University Objectivist Club. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening and thank you for coming to witness our debate, Capitalism versus Socialism, which is a moral system. Before I introduce our four participants in tonight's debate, I'd like to let everyone know that the George Washington University Objectivist Club and the Program Board are the proud sponsors of this event. The Objectivist Club is an on-campus student organization whose goal is to provide the opportunity for all students to become acquainted with ideas which are pro-reason, pro-reality, and pro-individual rights. Members will be available at the table in the foyer during the break and for a brief period after the debate to provide information about objectivism and the club. Our next meeting is November 20th, a week from this Thursday, next door at the Marvin Center. Dr. Ed Locke, professor at the University of Maryland, will conduct a question and answer period on objectivism entitled, "Why Does Man Need a Philosophy? Why Objectivism?" The public is invited to attend this free meeting. For all those who are interested, there will be a reception for tonight's participants immediately following the debate. This should give you the opportunity to speak with our four guests on a more personal level. It will be held next door in the Marvin Center, room 501. Now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce tonight's participants. First, the four debaters. On your left, arguing for the socialist position will be Christopher Hitchens and John Judas. Mr. Hitchens received his graduate degree in philosophy, politics, and economics from Balliol College in Oxford, England. He currently writes a column called The Minority Report for The Nation magazine. He is also the current American columnist for The New Statesman, the primary publication of the social democratic political left in London, England. Mr. Hitchens has edited and written several books, including his recently published Cyprus. He frequently debates conservatives on radio, television, and campus forums, and has appeared on William Buckley's television program Firing Line. Mr. Judas received his MA in philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley. He is a founding editor of the Socialist Review and is currently senior editor of In These Times. He is on the editorial board of The Progressive and writes political articles for the New Republic. Mr. Judas has just completed a biography of William F. Buckley, which will be published by Simon & Schuster in about a year. On your right, advocating the capitalist position, will be Harry Binswanger and John Ridpath. Dr. Binswanger received his PhD from Columbia University. He taught philosophy for many years at Hunter College in New York City. In 1979, he left the academic world to launch the Objectivist Forum, a magazine devoted to Ayn Rand's philosophy and its application to cultural issues. Dr. Binswanger's just published book, The Ayn Rand Lexicon, is a philosophical dictionary of objectivism. Dr. Binswanger has written and lectured extensively in support of the philosophy of objectivism. Dr. Ridpath received his master's degree in business administration from the University of Toronto and is a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia. He is currently an associate professor of economics and social science at York University in Toronto, where he has been the recipient of the prestigious award given by the Ontario Council of University Faculty Associations. Dr. Ridpath has been an advisor to the National Foundation for Public Policy Development, a Canadian think tank, and has spoken at the national policy conferences sponsored by the Canadian Progressive Conservative Party. Professor Stephen Keller, Director of Debate here at the George Washington University, has graciously agreed to moderate tonight's intellectual combat. Professor Keller is with the Department of Communications and Theater and teaches a variety of public address courses here at GW. I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking tonight's participants for taking the time to present their views on this important question, and Professor Keller for his assistance in planning and executing this confrontation, and the GW Program Board for its sponsorship. Under debate this evening will be the morality of each opposing system, socialism versus capitalism. The participants are expected to defend each system by presenting the underlying ethical principles upon which it rests. They have been selected because they represent extreme polar opposite positions. I'm stressing that the issue here is morality, not economics alone. We are here to debate the fundamental moral alternatives, to focus on the essential conflict between two absolutely opposed systems, socialism and laissez-faire capitalism. Thank you.
My guess is as the evening progresses, there will be very little question in your mind as to who is seated on the left and who is seated on the right. The intellectual enlightenment that will be served to us this evening will probably be very freewheeling. At the same time, it will have a time and a structure to it. The participants have agreed to the following speech sequence and time lengths. Each speaker, alternating back and forth between sides, will make an 8-minute opening statement. These opening statements will then be followed by each speaker making a 5-minute reply. After the opening statements and the reply, we very much encourage your participation. There will be a microphone set up at which you all are welcome to ask questions of the participants. Those questions can be directed to a particular participant or merely to a side. Following the questioning period, there will be a 4-minute per side closing statement. Those 4 minutes can be divided among the participants on that side however they choose. Starting us off this evening will be Mr. Harry Binswanger. Mr. Binswanger.
Thank you. The opposition between capitalism and socialism is a moral opposition. Each side must state and defend the moral basis of its political views. We champion capitalism as the only moral political system. What is morality? Morality is a code of values to guide man's choices. There is only one fundamental choice: to live or not, to be or not to be. If one chooses to live, then one must act in a certain way. One must achieve certain goals, certain values. One must satisfy one's needs. If one does not choose to live, then no action and no values are possible or necessary. One simply sits and waits to die. Life, in other words, is the ultimate goal at the root of all values. Life is a self-justifying primary. This is why you need a morality. You need a moral code in order to know how to live. And that means that the standard of morality, the abstract principle by which we judge good and evil, is man's life. Every species has a specific means of survival set by its nature. This is a simple biological fact. Unlike the lower animals, man has the power of choice, but he doesn't have a choice over his basic nature and his basic needs. What is man's means of survival? How does man get his food, his shelter, his safety, his health, and so forth? Well, obviously not by any great strength of muscle or by claw or fang, not by instinct, but by thinking, by reason. Reason, the conceptual faculty, is man's basic means of survival. Now, this is the key to our whole position, so I want to stress this. Reason, thinking, the use of man's intelligence is his means of survival. Man survives not by appropriating pre-existing values the way that animals do, but by creating new values. The means of doing this is productive work, and by production I mean the application of reason to reshaping matter to serve human ends. It is not true, in other words, that wealth exists in some static quantity, like a natural resource, so that when one person gets more, another automatically gets less. Life is not a zero-sum game. Wealth is created, it isn't found. And the creation of wealth takes knowledge. Knowledge is available only through rational thinking. Thus, reason is man's only means of knowledge and therefore his basic means of survival. Look around us. Right now, we're in a man-made world. We're in a man-made environment. Electric lights, plastic seats, clothes from artificial and natural fibers from all parts of the world, a microphone system. Where did all these things come from? They came from the minds of the scientists who discovered the physical laws involved, from the engineers who found out how to translate that abstract knowledge into working instruments, from the entrepreneurs who risk their capital to bring these things to a market to serve human needs, and in addition, the physical labor under the direction of the intelligence of the entrepreneur to produce them. The moving cause here, the basic source of all these things, is not then the physical labor as such. It's not muscle power. It is not that we expend more calories of energy per minute than the caveman, and that's why we are here in an auditorium lit by electricity, and he is in the cave. In fact, we put forth much less muscular labor today than in any time in human history. We even go out of our way to create exercise because we find ourselves doing so little in our work. The actual source of wealth, then, is man's mind, man's rational thinking capacity. Now, it is true that some men can attempt to live without using their minds, but they can do so only by parasitizing the wealth created by those who did choose to think and work. It is still true that man's life depends upon thinking, even though some people mooch or steal the products of the thinking of others. Those others had to think. Now, a morality whose standard is man's life, then, man's life as a rational, productive being, cannot permit such parasitism. A rational morality such as we are advocating does not advocate the master-slave relationship or the robber-victim relationship, but independence. Men must deal with each other as independent equals, each man being an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. Each man must stand on his own, achieve his own values, live his own life, earn his own happiness. He does get, of course, a value from the association with others. He's not a hermit. But there be no mistake about what we're advocating. We are advocating selfishness, rational, egoistic selfishness as the proper code for men to deal with each other. The reason is that selfishness is required by life as such. The opposite of selfishness, which means the achievement of your own values, is the surrender of your values, the sacrifice of a higher value to a lower value, or the sacrifice of a value to a zero, to nothing. Now, that is obviously the antithesis of life. Life is a process of value achievement. Full surrender of all values would mean death. Anytime you eat a mouthful of food for yourself rather than giving it to some starving Indian beggar, you're doing that on the principle not of altruism or self-sacrifice, but of egoism. Now, I want to be clear, rational selfishness does not mean sacrificing others to yourself. That would be inconsistent. Each man must be selfish, each man must live his own life, and men must trade value for value when they deal with each other. So we hold that man is born free, not only politically, but morally. You are not born in debt to others. You have no duties to others. You are not obligated to seek their happiness. You are the owner of your own life. Your life is not the means to any higher end. It is the ultimate end. As I said, it's your basic choice to live or not. Man is not a sacrificial animal. Now, in particular, we emphatically reject the idea that need is a claim. You know the slogan in the advertisement, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. We reject that because it's incompatible with human survival. A morality that sacrifices ability to need is a morality that holds suffering, lack, disease, impotence, failure as that which entitles one to receive values. The needs that must be considered are the needs of the producers, if you want to use that language. What social conditions are required for man to produce wealth? Well, since the production of wealth, I argued, is through reason, there's only one basic thing required. You must respect man's sovereign reason. This means one must oppose the use of physical force. One must deal with other men by persuasion, not by force. So a basic principle of capitalism is all interactions must be voluntary because the forced is the anti-mind, and the anti-mind is the anti-life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Binswanger. Mr. Judas will join the debate.
I was happy to learn that we would be having a debate between socialism and laissez-faire capitalism, because I'm uncomfortable debating capitalism rather than laissez-faire capitalism. Since I stand for a fleeting ideal myself, I prefer to have to contend with another fleeting ideal. I should warn you that my views as a socialist are not necessarily representative of all socialists. In one sense, I'm a radical, in another sense, I'm a conservative. I'm radical, I suppose, in the sense that I don't think that the the German Democratic Republic, the East Germany, is either democratic or socialist. And I'm conservative in the sense that I think that socialism itself will evolve out of capitalism and share many of the features of modern democratic capitalism. Not only the parliamentary system and civil liberties, but also the rudiments of the market and small and medium-scale private property as well. Now, what is the moral basis of socialism as I describe it? Well, I'm going to say something that might seem paradoxical here, and that is that the moral basis of socialism is really no different than that of laissez-faire capitalism. Socialism comes out of the failure of laissez-faire capitalism to realize its own ideals. Those ideals are basically three. One, which Harry Binswanger discussed, is an ideal of man himself, of human beings themselves, having a higher capability and of society itself being structured in such a way as to fulfill that higher capability. It's an ideal that comes from the Greeks, goes through Hegel, the Enlightenment thinkers. The other ideals are those of liberty and equality, and those were born out of the struggle to wrest capitalism out of feudalism. Liberty as the right to be free of inherited obligation, to be born not on a manner in which one's life was laid before him, but to have the possibility of doing different things with one's life. Equality, again, as being born neither in a particular caste or class, a rough equality, but an equality based on the absence of an aristocracy. Now, these three ideals of what one might call self-creativity, equality, and liberty were the ideals that informed Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, what one might call the democratic tradition in American thought. And the way that they conceived them being fulfilled was in terms of a society of equal small producers in which each person or family would be roughly equal, would be free, and would have the power to control their own destiny in society. Unfortunately, these dreams were not realized. Instead of a society of small producers, we had a society of large producers, a society of classes, a society in which poverty existed alongside great wealth. In other words, the society that we know as modern capitalism today. And socialism, as an idea of the 19th century, was born precisely out of the understanding that that society of laissez-faire capitalism could never be, and that in order to realize it, you would have to have a somewhat different kind of society, one in which human beings themselves owned the means of production, in which there were no classes. Now, here's the difficult part, because, as I said at the beginning, I'm a radical in the sense that I don't think that what we have today under the name of socialism is socialism. And I think we'll get to talk about that a little more in the debate, but let me just briefly explain what I'm talking about. Marx and the early socialists always assumed that socialism would arise only in highly industrialized societies with a democratic tradition. Highly industrialized because only in those societies would people have the time, would the productivity exist, in other words, where people would have the time to rule themselves. Democratic because only in those societies would people be educated, both in trade unions and parliament, to rule themselves. But socialist movements first took power not in highly industrialized societies, but in a semi-industrialized nation with a very scant democratic tradition, the Soviet Union, Russia. And socialism itself, as it evolved, came to be not so much a specific social system after the name of Marx, but rather a means of vindicating or legitimizing a movement that stood for something quite different for socialism. Most of the societies that call themselves socialism are no more socialist than most of the right-wing movements that call themselves democratic. I'm sure you know there are those. Now, the question is socialism itself, as I'm describing it, possible? Is it possible to fulfill this dream of liberty, equality, and self-creativity? There's a problem not only with existing socialist societies and the pall that they've cast over our notion of what it is to be socialist, but there's a problem, in fact, with Marx himself and the socialists of the 19th century. In my opinion, there's a fundamental error in Marx's thought, and that is what Marx understood, and the heart of what's valuable of Marx is that one society evolves out of the other. It both absorbs part of another society and it negates part of another society. That's going to be true of an economy of a socialist society. That is, we cannot conceive of what Marx conceived of as a socialist economy was simply the negation of a capitalist economy in which no markets existed and in which economic power would be concentrated in the collectivity. What happened as a result of that is that the collectivity became the state itself became ruled by a political elite, and as Hayek and von Mises and various other thinkers warned, one laid the basis, on behalf of Marxism, one laid the basis for totalitarianism. So what I'm describing as Marxism would have to be, in fact, a mix of laissez-faire capitalism and Marxism. What is called in the world today market socialism, but market socialism founded upon democracy. Thank you.
The debate this evening is in essence about two issues. The first issue is why the initiation of physical force is immoral, and the second issue is which social system employs the initiation of physical force and which social system rejects it. Professor Binswanger has addressed himself to the question of what are the standards of moral value that we employ in arguing for capitalism, and I'm going to apply what he has said to the question of capitalism as a social system. I'd like to start by observing that a society is nothing more than a collection of individuals who are interrelating with each other according to rules, laws, customs which pertain in that culture. If one asked, what is at the basis of these rules and these laws, one would discover that at the basis of these things lie certain philosophical principles, such as we have been discussing. Principles with regards to the nature of reality, the nature of man, what man's social needs are. That is why philosophical principles are at the heart of a social system. A social system, capitalism, socialism, whatever you like, the essence of these social systems is philosophical principles which underlie them. The fundamental identifying characteristic of any social system is the set of moral and philosophical principles which it embodies. And this debate really is about the differing principles underlying socialism and capitalism. Now, before discussing capitalism as a social system, I want to remark on the state, on government as the central social institution. It is the enforcer of the laws, of the principles which are in place in the culture. It is the central social institution. It is the, if you like, dominating social institution in a culture. If we would ask ourselves, what is the government? What is the state as a social institution? What is its essential defining characteristic? we would see that the essential defining characteristic of government is that it is that social institution that has a legal monopoly over the use of force in society. That is what government is. The central question with regards to any social system, therefore, is what are the principles dictating the way that the state relates to its individual citizens? Now, what would a moral social system be? A moral social system would be one which was based on pro-life principles, one which was based on the values that human life requires, one that serves man's life rather than destroys man's life, one in which the government is limited in its functions to the social requirements of human life. In other words, the moral social system would be one which acknowledged and protected man's fundamental social need, which is for freedom from the initiation of physical force in a social context. Now, it is the concept of man's rights which captures man's need to be left free from the initiation of physical force on the part of his neighbors when he deals with them in society. It is man's right to life, liberty, private property, and the pursuit of happiness which morally sanctions his need for freedom. The individual is a sovereign entity. His life belongs to him. It does not belong to anybody else, and it is immoral of anybody else or any social institution to attack him, to violate his rights, and force him to live for the needs of others. Man needs freedom to act. He cannot be physically barred from acting once he has decided through the irrational use of his mind on the goals he wishes to pursue. And if he should succeed in his actions, in gaining values, he needs the right to own those values and to retain them for his own use. He needs the right to private property. Without property rights, no human life is possible. The principle of man's rights is the bridge from morality to the question of the moral social system. The only moral social system, therefore, is the system which is based on the recognition of man's rights, on the recognition of man's need to be free from physical force. The only moral social system is that social system where the government is limited to this function, where it never initiates force in order to violate the rights of its own citizens, where it supplies the police, the armed forces, and the courts for dealing with rights violations, and in which it has no economic functions whatsoever. Just as state should be separated from church, state should also be properly, totally separated from economics. Now, the proper definition of capitalism as a social system is to identify the fundamental principle underlying capitalism. The fundamental moral principle underlying capitalism is the sovereign individual and his right to his own life and his own property. Therefore, the proper definition of capitalism is, it is the social system based on the uncompromising recognition and protection of individuals' rights. This is a definition in terms of fundamentals. Now, the socialists define capitalism as a social system where there is wage labor and where there is private property in the means of production. These are derivatives. It is true that there is private property in the means of production. It is true that there is wage markets, market for wage labor. But these are expressions of every individual's right to act on in his own interest and trade accordingly and voluntarily with his fellow men. So to identify capitalism as a social system exhibiting wage labor and private ownership of the means of production is superficial. The fundamental and proper definition of capitalism is that it protects every man's right to his own life. Now, the implications of properly defining capitalism are, first of all, that there is in a true capitalist society no connection between economics and politics. Economic power, which is earned by producers by virtue of their ability to produce values which other people will buy, is a positive. It is a benefit to everybody to have present in our society people who are capable of earning economic power. Political power, on the other hand, is based on the power of a gun, on the power of the government to actually violate men's rights, coerce them, expropriate their property, and it is a negative. And there is no connection in a capitalist social system, if it's properly understood, between business and government. Secondly, there is no advocation in capitalism of the right to goods per se. People only have the right to act freely. They do not have the right to the goods of others. There is no such thing as a right to a job, in other words, to force another person to give you a job, a right to an education, in other words, to force another person to give you an education, or a right to any such possessions at all. Now, given this, it is obvious that capitalism has never yet fully existed in human history. It lies ahead rather than behind. The 19th century, in Britain, in the United States, are the closest approximations of it, and we see great productivity and benevolence. The moral is the practical. But today we have no examples of capitalism in the world. We only have mixed systems, which in fact are systems of incompatible principles. Principles of statism, such as the socialists put forward, and some vestiges of freedom. Now, it is my view that having completed our comments, that we as capitalists have done what is required of us, which is to make a case for capitalism. That is our case for capitalism as the only moral system available to man. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ridpath. Mr. Hitchens will be making the final 8-minute statement.
Thank you, Professor. I think that the organizers of this meeting are to be congratulated on their brio and also, I think, on their timing. We are met today as witnesses of the decomposition of a political regime in this capital city, which uses the language of capitalism and of free enterprise, employs the ideology of selfishness and self-interest, and stresses the rhetoric of laissez-faire, while bloating and expanding the role of the state, debauching the treasury and the currency, and relying upon a state within a state for the secret conduct of most policy. There may, and I think there will not be, any convergence of ideas between socialist and capitalist schools this evening, but this need not prevent us, I think, from seeing that a regime may combine the basest features of statism and collectivism with the basest elements of utilitarianism and libertarianism too. And I think if we recognize that, we may have ground for debate. What is it, I better get on with it, to be a socialist? Necessary conditions in my submission, rather than sufficient ones, must include the following. It is necessary to hold, firstly, that all divisions of class, nation, race, and sex are, in the last resort, man-made and can be man-unmade, are in no sense part of a divine or natural ordinance, and that we are members, like it or no, of one race, the human race. That civilization is, in fact, second, a cooperative enterprise, whether the cooperation is coerced, as it was in most of recorded history, or voluntary, as has been occasionally found and can still be found in our century. But that it is a cooperative enterprise cannot be denied. There is no other means, that's to say, of civilization. Third, that the limits of creative endeavor are set by the limits of nature, and that very few human actions can therefore be said in the last instance to be entirely private. The earth is, in point of fact, a common treasury, as the English levelers used to say in the Puritan Revolution, hoping that it were so. It is, in fact, the case, and again, whether we like it or not, whether we care to treat it as such or not. Fourth, that there is no God and no supernatural, that this recognition obliges us morally to maximize the felicity of the one life that we are permitted. And fifth, that the principle of from each according to his ability or her ability, and to each according to his or her need, is an easily realizable one, prefigured already in human society by the working principles of the bourgeois family. That unique engine of thrift, enterprise, the transmission of morality, operates precisely on the principle of from each according to his or her ability and to each according to his or her need. There is, in fact, no other way that a family could decently or possibly be run. I make no moral judgment as between the decency and the possibility. Such a distinction would be odious. Marxists describe freedom as the recognition of necessity, and only then proceed to say that the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, a stipulation that obviously implies its corollary, that the educator must be educated, That's why I stress the above as necessary conditions rather than sufficient ones. We do not ask for these things to be true. We might even prefer them not to be, but we must recognize them as given and as such. Sufficient conditions, I think, center on the question of class. Marxists recognize that history is indeed the contest of competing social forces, and that so is the present such a competition. All attempts to describe society as merely organic and harmonious, or as a free competition or race between individuals with differing attainments and endowments, fail, because they ignore this simple and obvious fact, which again we do not preach, we simply recognize, insist upon, and make as a point of departure. Let me, if I may, quote you from Marx and Engels' preface to the German Ideology in 1845, where they say that they and their supporters, and I'm quoting now, "We do not preach morality at all. They do not put to people the moral demand, love one another, do not be egotists, etc. On the contrary, they are very well aware that egoism, just as much as selflessness, is in definite circumstances a necessary form of the self-assertion of individuals." I think this shows clearly enough that Marxists understand what Randians term, as if they discovered it, the virtue of selfishness. But as Marx and Engels also wrote in the same period in their Holy Family, they saw the need for selfishness to be transcended. I'm quoting again directly from the Holy Family, 1845 also. "If enlightened self-interest is the principle of all morality, man's private interest must be made to coincide with the interest of humanity. If man is shaped by environment, his environment must be made human." It is on this apparent paradox that we take our stand. And against the neo-Kantians, the early Marxists argued that morality could not be derived from abstract first principles of recht or right, but had to correspond to the real conditions of society. Nowadays, I think this argument seems quaint in its intensity and fervor, because evolution itself, and specifically the evolution of modern capitalism into a new symbiosis with the state, has borne in upon the dullest mind the recognition that if humanity does not yet think in terms of a common destiny, it has at least had to think in terms of a common fate. To put it at its most vulgar materialist level, we are all collectivized by the same ozone layer. The thermonuclear world is a great leveler, and just as there can be no purely moral, conscientious objection in a thermonuclear conflict, nor can there be any merely ethical or self-interested collaboration with it. Everybody, after all, in this auditorium is a uniformed conscript. You cannot conscientiously object to the nuclear conscription that has made of each of you soldiers and put you in the front line while the real soldiers are in the bunker. This recognition of reality enforces a sense of collective humanity upon us. Again, we do not preach this, we recognize it. Socialism, said Oscar Wilde, would free us from the distressing necessity of living for others. The feelings of compassion and solidarity and responsibility, after all, are no less instinct in our species than those of self-interest. It's precisely because these instincts of solidarity and compassion represent a human need, a need to be of help to others, a point very well made by Professor Richard Titmuss in his famous book, The Gift Relationship. Because they are a need, there is no need to make the sentimental presumption of altruism or to wrestle with the tautology that altruism represents. Marx and Engels, I'll close on this, in the preface to their 1848 manifesto, made capitalism a series of almost lyrical compliments. And in fact, few proponents of the capitalist system have ever summarized its virtues, those of creativity, innovation, the bursting of feudal and antique tribal fetters, as well as Marx did. But Marx and Engels also saw what's since become obvious, that capitalism is not the last word, and that in freeing mankind from ancient obligations, it made him a prisoner of market forces which also developed their own mythology and ideology, their own mystification, and their own bondage. Like Comrade Judas, I also believe that capitalism is the harbinger of socialism, that it's necessary not merely to contest or negate its ethical claims, but to transcend them, to build upon them. And from this, if I may coin a phrase, dialectic, I think we might get a truly human and unillusioned morality that was free from superstition or religion. On that realizable aspiration, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. The next 4 rejoinders will be 5 minutes in length, and they will follow the same sequence of the first 4. It will be after these speeches that the audience will begin its questioning period.
I'm a little bit at a loss since both of my opponents, or our opponents, seem to be presenting themselves as the Republicans used to the Democrats. Me too. We're for freedom too. We're for some form of laissez-faire integrated with socialism. We're for liberty. And we both share a dislike of Ronald Reagan. Well, we all 4 agree on that one point, that Ronald Reagan is a disgrace, probably for different reasons. Probably for different reasons. I didn't vote for him in either election because I thought he was a phony, and I agree with Mr. Hitchens that he preaches the rhetoric of laissez-faire, or at least of half-fair capitalism. But then his actions seem to be dictated by the New York Times. So I view him as a Carter in Reagan's clothing, in effect. That's for concrete application. But there seems to be so much rushing to agree with us that I wonder, are we doing better than I thought? People used to be absolutely knocked off their chairs by someone advocating laissez-faire, and maybe we've become a little bit too successful. So let's bring this down from the clouds a little bit. We advocate the immediate abolition of the antitrust laws. We advocate the immediate removal of the welfare system as fast as possible, perhaps over 4 or 5 years, to the total elimination of all welfare. We advocate the immediate abolition of the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Depository Insurance Company, the CCC, ICC, just about any alphabet agency you can bring up. I mean, we're talking about something very different from socialism. We're talking about untrammeled, complete free trade, where people can buy and sell as they choose as long as they do not initiate physical force against others. Now, I wanted to just respond to a few implications of ideas in the socialist side that I want to disavow. We do not hold equality as a value or virtue or ideal, if by equality you mean anything other than equal rights before the law. That term is used very ambiguously. Equal rights before the law, so that there is one system of justice in the law courts for rich and for poor, is exactly what I've been arguing for. Today, all the rights are on the side of the poor and the workers, and all the suffering is on the side of those big capitalist businessmen. They are considered guilty in any confrontation without the need for proof or evidence. They're considered guilty because they're greedy capitalists. So equality before the law, yes. But equality of income, equality of life, equality in any other sense, absolutely no. People have different abilities. People work with different degrees of intensity and effort and success, and to some extent just plain luck. And those inequalities have no moral significance whatsoever. I have never in all my years in philosophy come across any argument as to why there is any moral issue involved in one man having 1,000 times the wealth of his neighbor. I would like to know on what basis is there something wrong with that, and on what basis is it better if the incomes or wealths are equalized, because there is no such argument. As to the family being altruistic, I don't belong to a family. We are not Reagan conservatives. We do not stand up here and champion family. We champion the individual. I would like to find someone I can marry. I don't plan to have children. And if I have someone that I love, whom I marry, it won't be someone who joins with me on the basis of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It will be trading value for value, both economically and in terms of spiritual values. Finally, the idea of class and collectivism we totally disavow. There is no such thing as a class. There are just individuals. And I would claim, if I had time, that that's based on the denial of free will. Their view is based on determinism, the idea that if you're born in such and such a situation, you have to have the ideas and values of your parents. We uphold free will, that a man makes himself. Thank you.
Well, I wonder whether you found it as difficult to understand Christopher and I as I sometimes find it difficult to understand the objectivists. I think that we both have, to a certain extent, a metaphysics that we understand and that may not be comprehensible to people outside. At least I found myself at a loss at times trying to understand the meaning of such words as life and selfishness as I listened to my fellow debaters discuss capitalism. Let me try to restate, if I will, some of my argument, and while I do that, I'll refer to points that have been made. First, I see capitalism as a social system, as a historical system, not as an ideal that has not yet been realized, as a social system that evolved out of feudalism and that has a certain history, and it's a history that we can learn from. In the United States, the crucial part of that history is the one that really is at stake here. It's the history of the early republic. Because in those days were born the ideals by which we still live, by which we're governed, as Christopher mentioned, hypocritically. So that the crucial question for us is, how can those laissez-faire ideals be realized? And what happened in America? What happened during the Civil War? Why was it that we fought a war based on the idea of all men are created equal? And out of that, let's say 60 years later, we had a society in which there was gross inequality. Now, are there classes? Do people have free will? I think here there's a confusion of normative and description and descriptive terms, whether we're talking about how life ought to be or how life is. Whether, in fact, the society is organized a certain way and whether it ought to be organized a certain way. And what I'm trying to say is that out of this attempt in our Jeffersonian, Jacksonian period, the period of the Civil War, to create a society that was free and equal, a much different society got created, one in which there were not only differences in income, but differences in income that were related to differences in the relationship that people had to private property, and particularly to large-scale private property. And that's what we talk about when we talk about classes. And that helps us understand certain things about the society. Now, the state. Are governments necessary? Something that again, was an issue for Tom Paine and is an issue for us today. There are certain reasons, I think, why we have to have a government today and why it does have to play a certain role in the economy. And I don't mean just antitrust laws. I mean the experience of the Great Depression, of depressions that began in the early 19th century, panics leading up through the depression of the 1890s, the depression of the 1930s. Depressions which were caused by the anarchy of the capitalist system. The only solution for which was some form of government regulation, whether we like it or not. And today, I would suggest that in many, to a great extent, our own problems as an economy are declining balance of trade, if I can use such a mundane and dirty expression, in a time when we're talking about much more high-level things, is partly related to the fact that our economy is so structured so differently than the Japanese, and that we haven't sufficiently used our government in a creative economic way to increase our own productivity, but rather under the name of laissez-faire have only used it to protect certain forms of greed and largesse. So I hope we're not speaking entirely past each other, and that we can have this a fruitful discussion of what is at stake in this issue between capitalism and socialism.
Well, I've debated socialism, this is my 10th time. These are definitely the nicest socialists I ever debated. However, I think I'll take off the gloves a little bit here, because in fact there is fundamental difference on the stage, and I want to make it explicit what it is. Before I do that, I would like to say that the socialists have been putting forward the values that they say socialism embraces. I don't really think they have made an argument for those values. It's one thing to state your values. It's another thing to try and show why those values serve man's life. And I really don't believe that they did that. I thought that the idea of liberty that they put forward, which meant that we were to be born free of inherited duties and obligations, is a very small component of what it really means to a man to be free. So that I really am not convinced that the socialists have got into the ethics of the case for socialism, let alone the view of man that might underlie the ethics that they would have had to have argued for. The principle to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, is really an endorsement of the morality of altruism. The morality that some people, to live the virtuous life, should voluntarily give up some of their wealth so that others who have less can benefit. It is the morality of self-sacrifice. And they should argue for that morality. That is the morality that socialism attempts to institutionalize in society. They have not acknowledged the role of force in a socialist culture. They have said a few things which hint on that. Professor Hitchens, for example, I guess it isn't professor, is it? Referred to civilization throughout history was a matter of cooperation, and he said, as an aside, coerced or otherwise. It's a big difference. He also quoted Marx, where he said that Marx had said that private interest was all right, but it must be made to mesh with the general interest. Now, what does this mean? This means that the socialists, in fact, are advocates of what we can properly call a statist society, a society where the state has a big function to play, in essence, where the state is going to take over by expropriation the private property of the producers of a country and run that private property according to what they think is in the best interests of everyone. Socialism rests on an enormous act of expropriation of property, which is a violent act. And so consequently, the socialists have really not addressed the questions to the role of the state in their ideal society. It is no accident that every society in history, whether there has been yet achieved a perfect socialist society or not, every attempt has ended up, of course, with a very, very large role for the state to play, which is a denial of the rights of man and of man's need for freedom in a social context, and is exactly the opposite of what we are talking about. It turns out, as Mr. Judas said, that we notice, he claims that the anarchy of capitalism caused depressions, which set up a stage for the need for government. Well, in fact, there is a very good debate, which I think is conclusive that, in fact, it was not the market that caused depressions. It was interference with the market that caused depressions, and it was early statism which then turned and used the depression as an excuse for more statism. But the fact of the matter is they are advocates of statism. They, in essence, say, you know, it turns out that if we leave people free, there are unfortunately problems which develop, and so consequently we have to bring the state to bear in order to create the beautiful world. So the essence of what the socialists are talking about, in my judgment, is give me the power of government. Give me the gun, because I want to build a beautiful world according to my blueprint, and I have plans through which I will coerce everybody who would not voluntarily cooperate with these plans into living in the beautiful future which they apparently do not understand. Now, we're opposed to that. We are standing up for freedom in a serious way. We are standing up for the principles this country was founded on. We are standing up for the principle of man's inalienable rights, and we are taking them seriously and not willing to compromise them at all. Now, I want to conclude by saying that Mr. Judas started, and he said that he referred to laissez-faire capitalism as a fleeting ideal. It is not a fleeting ideal. Despite their claims that capitalism has already existed, it has not, for the reasons I've presented. But it can exist. Ideas determine human history, and that's what this debate is about ideas for the future of this culture. And hopefully, if the ideas we're putting forward eventually hold sway in this culture, we will be fortunate enough to see a true laissez-faire ideal. It will be not a fleeting ideal by any means at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ridpath. The last speaker at this stage of the debate will be Mr. Hitchens. Following Mr. Hitchens' presentation, the audience questioning will commence. Mr. Hitchens?
I regret that what I say will be a little more fragmentary than my opening presentation, because there are a number of challenges that have been offered to our side, which I mustn't let pass, but can only deal with one at a time. First, I specifically did not state that the principle of from each, etc., as I think we can agree to call it, as embodied in the bourgeois family, was a principle of altruism. It was simply a principle of necessity. There is no other way that that a family could be run, and that therefore this principle prefigures the extension of such a principle to society itself, and we can see it, as it were, in the womb of the old, as Engels would have said and was in fact over fond of saying. Now there's a very great and unrecognized, I think, in their own minds, confusion in our two opponents here about capitalism, liberty, and private property and the relationship between them. The history of capitalism, and even more so, this should be said of the history of capitalism in its imperialist phase, its heroic period, is the history of expropriation. It is the history of the robbery of private property from millions and millions of people. Marx, observing this process in the Communist Manifesto, remarks on the tremendous advances in productivity and technique and innovation that were thereby enabled, but he does point to the fact that many, many people who hitherto had owned land, property, and so on, were expropriated, collectivized, and made into the modern proletariat. He thought the price was worth paying. He thought capitalism was an advance over what had gone before, but let nobody tell you that capitalism cannot coexist with the expropriation of private property. It can and does. This, I think, would assist us to answer an even more intriguing question, which is why it is that capitalism has only ever evolved successfully in a very few countries. I think this is very probably because, I'll have to be condensed here, because its evolution ab initio was based on the robbery of other countries' wealth and productivity. Let me again remind you of what Marx said about India. A tremendous expropriation by British imperialism of the resources of capital accumulation from India. An enormous an enormous input to the British Industrial Revolution, still the heartland of the evolution of capitalism, but a fantastic desolation of private property in India. Again, Marx thought it was probably, in the long run, justifiable, because India would in the end succeed in coming together as a state and overcoming the feudal ties imposed by the Mughal emperors that had been sundered by the imperialist invasion. But don't let anybody suggest to you for an instant that capitalism does not regard people as means. Probably more than any other system in history, it has made a virtue of that ability, of the ability to conscript, to expropriate, and to dispossess in order to become an engine of wealth. And that is why, finally, the responsibility for the overweening power of certain states is that, historically speaking, of capitalism. Because in the countries where capitalism either did not, or because of imperialism, could not take root, capital accumulation had to be done another way. You can't not have capital, after all, though you can not have capitalism. And capital can be accumulated one way or it can be accumulated the other. And in the oriental despotisms of the East and the modern versions of those, capitalism had to be substituted for by the state. But that is because of the failure of capitalism. It's intimately related to it, let me say. I can't blame them for everything. Thus, it's perfectly simplistic to say that capitalism represents freedom from state power, because both in the countries of its success and in the countries of its failure, the relationship with the modern state, the giant state, the state that can regard the citizen as its property for large numbers of practical purposes, is very close indeed. And I think this, what I have said, should be enough in itself to rebut the ridiculous accusation that only socialists are interested in violence. I could stand, or need it for the vindication of their program. I really could stand here all night and read the list of names of people who've been murdered by capitalist regimes when the interest of illicit private property and governments based on it is felt to be threatened. There is no length to which capital will not go in those contingencies. Fascism was capitalism. The structure of the capitalist state in Germany survived and coexisted, and in Italy and in Spain, survived and coexisted with the fascist period throughout. I don't mean to say that capitalism is fascism, but capitalism can coexist with any system, and its attitude to liberty is as instrumental and contingent as its attitude to equality. I see I have no more time, but I'm prepared to defend anything I've said at greater length in the subsequent period. Thank you.
At this point in our debate, we would very much like to encourage your participation. Were Marshall McLuhan in this audience, he would, however, smile, because we would request of you, so that this whole enterprise, if I might use that word, is memorialized on tape, that you excuse those around you and pop up and go to the microphone to ask questions as you will. And if we could take, the next minute or so and give that to people who know that they would indeed like to ask some questions, would you please then wend your way to the mic and form some kind of a, haphazard line behind it, and we will begin the questioning process shortly. You'll need to turn on table mics. Okay. Excuse me?
We're getting straight into it.
Yes, we are. We'll be going straight into it. My charge, if I might make one, to the questioners is that they make their questions brief, that they indeed be questions, and that they, of course, allow the participants an adequate time to respond. After each brief question, the side or the person that it is directed to will have an opportunity, of course, to respond, at which time, after which, I will turn to the other participants and ask them if they would like to comment on the question as well. With your assistance, we'll be able to have as many questions as you are motivated to ask, and we'll be able to move the program along crisply. Would the first gentleman like to ask a question?
Yes, one for each side, if I may. For the capitalists, I'm curious to know why, in modern society, you view physical force as the exclusive or even the most insidious form of coercion. In a society in which you may build a home and find a toxic waste dump built next to it if there's no such thing as zoning laws, do you think that you can legitimately restrict your analysis to physical force, and which side is most guilty of its imposition? For the socialist side.
One question at a time, please.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Do I have a mic here?
I think you do.
Yes. I'd like to answer your real question, which is the first part. Your example does not illustrate. If there is a toxic waste dump, if someone dumps toxic waste next to your home, that is physical force. That is the infusion of deadly chemicals into your property and perhaps into your body. And if you can go into court and prove that, you can have the government in a capitalist society make him compensate for you, make him remove it and make him compensate you for any damage. What I think you want to contrast it with is so-called economic power. Why do I consider physical force the only form of coercion versus economic power, where a big business, General Motors, supposedly can make you buy their cars, IBM can make you buy an IBM computer? I have to leave it to the socialists in the audience or on the stage to give better, more convincing examples, because I can't hold it in my mind. The reason I make such a distinction, well, advertising is supposed to be brainwashing, and there's another example of economic power. The reason why I make a distinction is that physical force is the only thing that can cause your reason to be inoperative. It nullifies your reason. Remember, my whole case was life is an ultimate value, reason is the major means of achieving it, and therefore no force, because the force is the anti-mind. If somebody comes up to you with a fantastic commercial to try and get you to buy some product, that is not anywhere in the same universe from someone coming up, pointing a gun at your head and saying, "Give me your wallet." One leaves your mind free to function, and it's up to you to judge the validity of the computer, the advertisement, or whatever. The other deprives you of the ability to act on your thinking, and that is the very nature of coercion. I mean, that's the meaning of coercion, making you act against your will. Well, your will is the ability to act according to your mind's decision. So that's why there's a life and death difference between force and any other kind of social influence. I have to give one other example. It's considered force in some quarters if you're not given help when you need it. Well, that is completely wrong. If a woman that I want to sleep with won't sleep with me, that is not force. If I break my leg through my own carelessness or through lightning striking it and someone else won't heal it, that is not imposing force upon me. Force means force. It means physical contact with another's person or property against his will without his consent. And that's the only thing that can negate a mind and therefore destroy a life.
Thank you, Mr. Binswinger. Socialist response?
He's got a question for us, I think.
I would like to at least initially limit the questioners to one question apiece. You're welcome to move to the end of the line and get ready to ask your next question. Thank you so much. Your single question, sir.
Yes. I'd like to pick up on a claim that Mr., if I can call him Mr. Ridpath, said that the socialists were just stating values and didn't get into their ethics. I'd like to advance a thesis and have both sides comment on this, and that is that there is a very basic metaphysical difference between the objectivists and the socialists. The socialists seem to be saying that a socialist system is a historical inevitability. That talk about morality is superfluous. The socialists are just pointing out a trend that must lead to socialism. The objectivists are claiming that man is historically autonomous, There's no historical context that necessitates the evolution towards any political system. Social ethics are needed to help us decide which political and economic system we should adopt. My thesis then is that there is a basic metaphysical difference between the socialists and capitalists in this debate.
A much more cleverly asked double question. Would the socialists like to respond first?
Well, is this mic on? I suppose the different, let me put the difference another way. Our capitalist opponents, if I can call them that, I think that don't have a conception of history upon which they base individual possibilities and values, whereas what I would say of our view is that it is framed in terms of what is historically possible. And the ideals that socialists believe in are themselves ideals that have arisen through various historical struggles. So that I think that's the difference. I think it's a difference between, if I may put it away, a kind of a timeless metaphysics of man and a historical philosophy.
Thank you.
Hello. I think that in some respects you're right. I don't know that all socialists take the deterministic view that Marx took, but I think you have hit on a point that the socialists, certainly the ones that are historical determinists, may not find it necessary to make arguments for the pursuit of different human values because their view is that these things are in a sense historically conditioned, whereas the objectivists are certainly advocating a view of man which regards man's free will as the crux to all of his moral choices and regards man as in control of his destiny at every moment in history. So in that sense, we don't have what is just referred to as a historical perspective, if you like. Human beings are human beings. The question is, what is the nature of a human being? How does a human being live? What does he require? What are the needs of human life? And our argument is that this has been true of human beings through history. It is not a historically relative thing, that men have required freedom all through history, and the fact that they have had freedom so infrequently through history is a sad commentary on human history up until this time. But it does not prove the historically determined set of values that some socialist determinists believe is the case.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Let me first of all say that I think that the most promising thing we've heard tonight for the future of our social system is that Mr. Binswanger has agreed not to have children. My question to you, Mr. Binswanger, my question to you tonight, the question tonight is one of moral justification. I'd like to ask you how you can morally justify, and you attempted to, a system which admits to the justification of inequality, economic inequality, where the accumulation of wealth, the ownership of property does not necessarily, as you said, need to be equal. Perhaps if all things were equal to start with, if everyone was starting out on the same starting line,
Sir,
yes.
Mr. Binswanger has informed me that he objects to the ad hominem comment and will not be answering your question. And I would hope and I would hope that we could keep the level of the debate not only clever, but on the point of the issues involved. Next question, please.
My question to the...
No, sir, you have asked your question. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to ask those Harry and John, the capitalist system. I think it's, I believe, the Anglo-Saxon society, most of the time thinking exploitation. Historically, we tell us comparing with the theory of the Greek or Roman society. I'm talking about this modern capitalism, where is this monopolize, exploit, and not oligopolies, this practice, too much exploitation to people. However, the capitalism is just almost 10% up in class. So I'd like to ask you a question, please. The capitalism is unmoral because Jesus, who's king of the earth, also was sympathized with the socialism. True or not, please?
Take it, I got it. Okay. If the question is true or not that Jesus was a socialist, I would think you have a good case to make. The case that we are making for capitalism is a case for a social system, as I said in my remarks, that hasn't yet existed. All that you hear about the alleged evils of capitalism with regards to exploitation and with regards to monopolies and all of this is quite frankly a complete misrepresentation of what capitalism is. It does not relate to what we are talking about at all. But I will say in regards to bringing in Jesus, that the fact of the matter is that the case we are making is a radical attack on the ethics of Judeo-Christianity. We are rejecting the cross. We are rejecting sacrifice. We are rejecting state-enforced sacrifice. We are standing up for man's mind, for reason, for this earth, and for freedom. So you're right, Jesus and we are on opposite sides.
A rejoinder?
Yes, is my microphone live? Yeah. There's a trite school of thought that does try and maintain that you can derive socialism from Christianity, and I hope I've said enough to make plain that I think that's nonsense. Christianity is historically the ideology of feudalism and of slavery, and with those it's been very strongly compatible, and I think remains. As to whether Jesus was or was not, I don't know, because I have no view of whether he existed or said any of the things that are attributed to him. Some of the more popular remarks attributed to Jesus, I would say uncontroversial remarks tending towards a view of the brotherhood of man, are of course pre-Christian. Wholly admirable points about the interdependence of the human race and the need to help others for one's own sake. These are uncontroversial, pre-Christian, and obviously easily assimilable to socialist morality.
Thank you. Next question.
And there are about 40 countries in the world that call themselves socialists today, including some of those who have perpetuated the most appalling deeds of violence against human beings in our century. And the amount of violence seems to be in adverse proportion to the non-socialist elements mixed into the particular society. Even if the arguments socialists are true, should we risk a system that can obviously go so easily off the rails?
Off the rails. Metaphor.
Just to show how complicated things are here, let me first make a remark about this last controversy, which is that I have to dissent from my comrade Hitchens' view of Christianity and religion, even though I am on the Judeo rather than the Christian side of the controversy. You have to remember Christianity is also the religion of the early Puritans. I mean, there's a lot of you can make a case for socialism coming out of a certain strain of Christianity, though to equate one with the other would be silly and trite. Now, socialist societies today, both our sides are in kind of a peculiar position, which is whenever we accuse the capitalists of doing something terrible, they say, well, we're not talking about that, we're talking about our capitalism, and we're in the same problem here. Let me try to make the point, though, analytically rather than normatively or morally. Hegel had a concept of the cunning of reason. Do you know that idea? It's the idea that what people intend to do, that history isn't the sum of individuals' intentions, and that you cannot understand a society necessarily by its name. The fact that so many societies call themselves socialism doesn't mean that the historical movement that began in the 19th century has come to fruition in the 20th century. Instead, we have a kind of example of the cunning of reason, where a name has been appropriated, just as the Nazis appropriated the name socialism. It was at the time the name of a popular philosophy and a popular politics. You have to remember, things were not as they are today in America, and to be called a socialist in Europe was something desirable. It was a way of winning working class support. So the Nazis called themselves National Socialists. There are social democratic parties around the world that have very little in common. I think in South America there's several that are you might call it almost national capitalist in nature. So a terminology doesn't necessarily make history, and that you have to explain the term and understand how it came to be.
Rejoinder?
Well, just a quick comment that while I gather your question is, what do the socialists have to say about the fact that approximations of their ideas seem to have resulted in so much destruction in the 20th century?
And have so many failure nodes built in on the way to achieving whatever.
Yeah, and their answer is that, well, their ideals have been misappropriated in the 20th century. Well, that may or may not be the case, depending on what particular version of socialism one is putting forward. But the fact of the matter is that Karl Marx, for example, is not unrelated to what has happened in the 20th century. Hegel is not unrelated to what has happened. He's a major influence on the Nazis. And I must say that even though I'm not familiar with the writings of my opponents, but they haven't said anything to me to suggest that they personally endorse the bloodshed of the 20th century. But I will say this, some of the principles that they share are shared by the tyrants of the 20th century that have caused that bloodshed. They are statists. Socialism of any kind is a statist philosophy. And what has caused the bloodshed in the 20th century is different versions of statism. So rather than have to say, well, we're a different version of this creed which has in fact caused so much destruction, at least we can sit here and say we reject the whole creed altogether.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could crave your indulgence, if I was allowed to speak at this point, I think I could economize on later questions tending to the same point, and clear up an earlier misrepresentation of our position all at once. May I try?
Yes, you may.
It is the single most vulgar misrepresentation of Marxism to say that it's determinist. The person who says that of it convicts himself at once of never having opened a book by Marx or by a Marxist. It was, for its time, and remains the most determinedly and avowedly anti-determinist mode of thought in philosophy. Most famously, and you'll see why I'm stressing this in a second, Marx began his most famous account of history and revolution, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, by saying men make history, but they do not make it under circumstances of their own choosing. They make it, but under circumstances directly transmitted and engaged from the past. The traditions of all the dead generations, he then famously added, weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living. That's not determinism, self-evidently not determinism. Now, let me say why I think this bears on the question of violence. Men make history, but they can't choose when and how they're going to make it. If it was up to me, and I think I would carry John Judas with me here, the Russian Revolution would have happened in 1905, when there was a large democratic revolution led by socialists that was put down by the Tsar, and which, with tremendous bloodshed and repression, and which paved the way for a ghastly imperialist war in which millions of Russians were killed under the leadership of the system of hereditary God-given monarchy, which was the system with which capitalism in Russia was at that time coexisting. Now, it is not, therefore, by the socialist choice that revolution took place in Russia at the close of that gigantic war and bloodletting and gigantic tearing apart of the fabric of Russian society to the point where cannibalism had re-emerged in the countryside. an emergence in my submission that is not unrelated to the later course of events in the Soviet Union. It's quite simply unhistorical to say that, well, revolutions devour their children. You then surrender the need to analyze history, and you can simply look at history as the working out of that proposition. Very good means of economizing on thought, and one that I think should be repudiated by any thoughtful objectivist.
Thank you. A brief rejoinder, and then we're going to return to the questioning.
All right. Let's look at this in principle. Let's not try and say, well, maybe because it was raining in South Yemen when they took over, it was a bad time for them to take over, and that's why socialism failed. And maybe because Afghanistan went this way, and because Cuba is dependent on one crop, and because, there's always an explanation ad hoc as to why every single socialist nation that takes socialism seriously ends up with concentration camps and mass slaughter. Let's look at it in principle. In principle, what else can you expect if the government owns all the property in the country? If there is no right to private property, if you cannot own your own printing press, for example, from which you can criticize the government, if the state owns all the printing presses, all the radios, if the means of making a living is in the hands of one group which maintains it by force, the government, so that he who does not work shall not eat, becomes a government edict. What else can you expect? If you make it a crime to trade on the black market, in other words, to engage in capitalist acts, yet people have to engage in these black market activities in order to feed themselves, what else can you expect but more and more black market and more repression to keep it down? There's no escape from a system of any status kind leading to disaster if it gives all that power to the government. Now, the capitalist system says the most dangerous thing in the world is a government. Let's restrain it. Let's keep it down. Let's give it only one function, the function of protecting your freedom from criminals and foreign aggressors. Let's not let it mess in any other area of your life. Let's just have the police and the law courts, and let's not have it be also your employer and the owner of everything. So, in other words, we believe in very, very drastically restricted, limited government. Now, since government's the culprit here, doesn't that point to the answer to your question?
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, since there's a need for brevity, I'll make my question as short as possible. If one does an historical analysis of the situation as it exists in the world at present, there's an increasing tendency on the part of third world countries to gravitate towards the socialist ideal, whatever it may be. And I'd like both sides of the fence to address the question as to why this is so. Is it an ineptness on the part of radicals and intellectuals, or is it a clear analysis of historical perspectives?
Capitalists, I'd like to start.
Yeah, I've observed that myself. I, of course, would put a different coloration on it than the other side. I think the more advanced and intellectual countries have learned that socialism just does not work. So the only place that socialism can be sold now is in very backward countries that are, in effect, still following the fashions of the 1930s. But it's, you notice in Italy, for example, they came to the brink of Euro-communism and backed off. In France, they had a socialist government and backed away from it. I don't think you can fool the people anymore the way you could in the 30s in an industrial civilized society by saying, you know, we want socialism because we don't want to promise you pie in the sky. We want to make you rich here on earth, and socialism is the way to make you rich. That was the original promise of socialism. Money, food, shelter, work, but, you know, a good job and rewarding income. Now, that's just, you know, been completely disproved by, quote, historical analysis, by facts. And the only place you can get away with it now is with people who aren't that well educated. Now, I hope that's not taken as an ad hominem. That's my hypothesis as to, you know, why it is that it is not possible to spread true socialism in an advanced society.
Rejoinder.
That reminds me of one of William Buckley's comments in an interview in 1961 when somebody asked him why, whether he thought what was at the time the Belgian Congo, they were fighting for their independence, whether were ready for democracy, and he said, well, they'd be ready for democracy when they stop eating each other. That not to be so much to be funny as to signal my disagreement with the perspective of Mr. Binswanger. My own view is that the reason that third world countries that socialism has been popular is that you have to conceive of the world economy as a gigantic division of labor, in which most of those countries' economies have been pretty much at the behest of the core economies in the world, the advanced capitalist countries, in which they've been structured in such a way as to benefit those core economies, but not to benefit themselves. So you have sort of single crop agriculture, primarily for export. You have no internal market in those countries. And the ruling elites that go away to school and come back get it into their heads that in order to change that around, they have to have some form of a command economy where they take control of their own society and their economy. Now, when they've done that and when they've experimented with it, while sometimes they've found that they do need elements of a market and then foreign capital is attractive. But that's the reason that that element of the socialist idea appeals in those countries.
Thank you. Next. May another questioner please ask a question? Thank you.
My question is directed to Mr. Hitchens in reference to the comments he made at the last part of the formal debate. You gave the argument that because capitalism in practice requires expropriation and robbery, that there are so few developed capitalist states, and gave the example of the alleged British expropriation of India. This leads me to wonder from what part of India did the British expropriate the steam engine and the many intellectual developments which sparked the Industrial Revolution in that country. If material goods were the fundamental prime cause of the Industrial Revolution, why didn't the Indians have their own Industrial Revolution centuries before the British came along? In summary, I ask, didn't the Industrial Revolution require reason and intellect as its prime cause rather than expropriation?
Would that the question was as clever as it sounds. Have you, sir, or has anyone else here, read Edmund Burke's speech on the impeachment of Warren Hastings? You might care to turn it up. It's a kind of a classic conservative text. In there you will find laid out in some detail the description of the enormous transfer of wealth from India to the islands in the North Sea, known as Great Britain and Northern Ireland today. Burke was in fact so alarmed by this process, it wasn't out of compassion for India that he mentioned it. He was alarmed that the process was in fact enriching a whole new class that would corrupt Parliament in Britain, and not without reason, and that's why Hastings had to be impeached. That is how some of the capital that led to the Industrial Revolution was accumulated. That's what I said. Now, it's also true that India got the steam engine as a result, probably rather earlier than it would have otherwise, which is why Marx said, as I said, that the British were probably justified in putting down the Indian Mutiny of 1857, because that mutiny was not a struggle for independence, it was an attempt to restore the Mughal imperial authorities, who were a relatively less advanced mode of production. Now, is that clear? If I didn't make it clear before, let me take the opportunity to make it clear now. That is the compliment Marxism pays to the origins of capitalism. I haven't yet, though, had an answer to my question about why capitalism did not emerge in such very large and theoretically prosperous and productive areas of the globe. And I do think that it is a question that deserves an answer from the capitalist side.
Rejoinder?
I'm having somewhat of trouble hearing every word. There's something in the sound system, the acoustics. We have some trouble hearing you over here. But I heard a couple of things that I will respond to. Colonialism is the best thing that ever happened to the colonies. We view the colonialization of India and the rest of the world by England primarily, and then later by other countries, including ourselves, as the extending of wealth and civilization to backward regions. all the interactions, in essence, I mean, I can't say that, every single one of them, but the essence, the thrust of those interactions was free trade, voluntary employment for people who were otherwise starved. As one other aside concrete from this, the Arabs have no right to that oil. The same principle. Oil under the feet of people who don't know what property is, who don't have a civilized society, who are nomads or dictatorships, is not the property of their little king. It is the property of anybody who comes in and produces it. And it was the American and Western oil companies that produced that oil. They even went and made contracts with those little petty dictators, even though they morally had no claim to that oil. And the same principle goes to any other natural resources. Natural resources belong to those people who make use of them. And there was the civilized countries that took things that were just junk and garbage to the rest of the world and paid them for them. The transfer of wealth was both ways and much more to the benefit of the backward people, as sheer common sense would tell you, than it was to England. India needed England 1,000 times more than the other way around. Now, the challenge, which I hadn't heard before, was why didn't capitalism develop in large areas of the world like India where it didn't develop? Because we believe that capitalism does not develop out of historical necessity, but out of people's ideas. Capitalism reached its apex in the United States in 1776 because the ideas of the people were those of John Locke. Every one of the founding fathers read John Locke, they read Aristotle, they read Cicero. This is known fact. The language of John Locke's second treatise of government is in the Independence, the Declaration of Independence. The political philosophy of England at that time was what caused capitalism to exist here. Now, needless to say, the opposite political philosophy is in place in areas like India. I mean, they are mystics. They don't believe in reason, they don't believe in nature, they don't believe in natural rights. So the answer is, where there is a pro-capitalist philosophy, their capitalism will flourish. Where there isn't, it won't.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, I'd like to ask this question of Mr. Hitchens, and it's a question that seems to be purely practical, but really it does have a theoretical underpinning as well. It implies a theoretical question. And that is, I have a question about how you would see how we ought to best make the transition to socialism. And in particular, what I'm wondering about is how far you take what you took as your first principle of socialism, and that was that divisions of class, sex, and race ought to be ignored in the establishment of it. And what I'm wondering in particular is, how would you look upon, for example, affirmative action quotas in hiring? And the reason I ask that question is it seems to me that socialist ideology, Marxist ideology, has a tendency, and perhaps this is not fair to accuse anyone on the stage of this, but other theorists, to view man as an economic entity, as filling the way to look at man in order to understand his place in society is to look at the way he interacts with other people on a material basis. And so this is my question. How would you look at that particular way of establishing social justice?
Yes, I think it's certainly a two-part, maybe a tripartite question. On the matter of transition, you asked me to deal with an enormous subject. I would say this sketchily and ask to be forgiven. It is the stated position of many conservative ideologues in Western capitalist Europe that the economies of Western Europe have, in a sort of vegetable evolution, already become social democratic. And though I don't think that claim is wholly true, there is a great deal of truth in it. There are countries, the one most often cited, so I'll cite it for convenience, is Sweden, where though the vast majority of the economy remains in private hands, and in fact in the hands of the same families as controlled Swedish capitalism in the 19th century, same names, rather like German capitalism before and after Nazism, and during, of course. There is not more than a welfarist conception of society in Sweden, very nearly a social democratic coexistence. So that's one case where one might almost call it an evolution. In other cases, my theory is the ones I've cited, the Soviet Union, and I would add to these China and Cuba, where capitalism simply broke down and there was no force or agency ready to take over the running of the countries but the communist and socialist movements. But capitalism abandoned and evacuated and failed in those countries, leaving no alternative. You could say that was a revolution, or you could simply say it was a collapse. Calling it a transition would certainly be weak. I have a feeling I'll be taken up on some of this, but that's my broad brush transition statement. On the apparent paradox in what I say about overlooking or transcending differences among the broader family of the human race, my own view is that that is compatible with making a stand for affirmative action, because it is a willed compensation for past wrongs, and one has to be able to identify and compensate a given group. That isn't to discriminate in the pejorative sense. Actually, it is the racialist who cannot discriminate. I've never understood why racialists are accused of discrimination. It's the one faculty of which they're not capable. They think that all members of a certain race have the same characteristics and don't show the ability to discriminate among them as humans. As to the economic man, no, look, we don't believe that you are what you eat. It can be shown that you aren't what you don't eat, and if you don't, you are not. But the corollary wouldn't, and I'm afraid there's a lot too much of that, a lot of it in the capitalist world. But no, we realize that there are other needs, many of them non-material. Let me suggest an example to you, the case of the person who gives blood and does so voluntarily and without a reward. There's no sacrifice involved in that. You don't lose a pint of blood by giving one, but you do help another person. And you don't have to posit altruism. You have fulfilled your own need to help and be of service without giving up anything and without a cash transaction, and you've increased the general welfare. I regard that as a socialist attitude to one's fellow creatures and perfectly unsentimental.
Thank you. A brief rejoinder.
Yes. I agree with much of what you said in the middle, that racism is the failure to discriminate. I think that racism is a form of collectivism, which says that the collective that counts is a racial one, as opposed to Marx, for instance, who thinks the collective that counts is an economic one. But we reject all those and say that collectives don't exist. Individuals exist, and they are to be judged on the basis of their own attributes, their own choices, and their own actions. So I would maintain that only individualism is an antidote to racism. As in relation to the giving blood example, well, sure, there are, I don't personally find giving blood to be that easy. I tend to faint, but if you take an action where the cost to the individual is so minimal that he, in effect, won't miss it, and someone else is benefited by it, fine, there's no argument against that whatsoever. It's very nice. There are a lot of things in human life are that way, like when you smile and say hello to somebody or good morning, how are you? It doesn't cost you anything. It expresses benevolence and respect for human life. But that has nothing to do with the question of people are dying right now in hospitals in many parts of the world, including the United States, where certain people could save them. But it would require them giving a lot of their blood. Maybe one person, if we took, he's got a rare blood type. Here's the question I pose. One person has the Rh negative type O or something. If we took all his blood, we could save 5 other people's lives. Now, that's not far-fetched. Do you have the right to take all his blood? Do you have the right to take 1 drop of his blood if he doesn't consent? Capitalism says no. So remember, when you say, repeatedly we've heard the theory, capitalism historically didn't work out, there was nothing to replace it, capitalism gave rise to problems, as if capitalism were some independent entity. Remember, when we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about freedom. We're talking about free trade. We're talking about non-interference. So what they're really saying is, well, we tried leaving people free, but it just didn't work out, so we had to come in with a different system.
Thank you. In deference to the line of questioners and the late hour and at least the heat on this stage, if the subsequent questioners could please state their question very briefly, and if the respondents to the questions could As Edwin Newman might ask on Meet the Press, please give the briefest of answers, something around the category of 1 minute each. We could then work our way through many of the questioners who are still in line. Next question, please.
Dr. Binswanger, you gave a brief response regarding how the to each according to his need related to the family. I was not really satisfied with your answer. In what I have read of objectivist writings...
Precisely to your question, sir.
My question is, what does objectivism have to offer to children, to people who do not have a fighting chance as adults? What does it have to offer to quadriplegics, to people who are weak and cannot help themselves?
Thank you.
What does socialism have to offer to those who are able to help themselves? And how do the quadriplegic and the weak hope to survive if the producers are throttled so that they can't produce? There's really two questions there. One is the issue of parents and children and from each according to his ability and so forth. The parent-child relation is not the relationship of adult citizens to each other, which politics is primarily concerned with. Certainly, a parent owes the care to its child, and the child owes gratitude for that care if it's provided properly. But the point is that you are not a child, and the government should not treat you as a child. There is such a thing as reaching the age of reason. But under some forms of government, that age is never reached. In other words, they never believe that you reach adulthood and have rights. It is not altruism, but love that the parent-child relationship exhibits. It is not to each according to his need. So you want me to cut out? Okay.
Thank you. Response, please.
Well, the question wasn't really to us, I think. We may as well press on.
Wonderful. Next question, please.
I have a question for Mr. Hitchens. You've spoken on this subject, but I'm still not sure of your opinion. On the most basic level of this debate, it seems to me, has addressed the question, do the ends justify the means? In your opinion, do they?
I don't find it possible to say no to that question. I think there's more absurdity and more contradiction and less interest in the study of history revealed in someone who simply says no to that than there is to someone who says yes. But someone who says yes clearly invites about 8 further questions, which you haven't asked. I don't mean to be either evasive or elusive.
Next question, please. Thank you. Very briefly.
Vague. I could say, yes, the ends justify the means. If the ends are rational, then the means will be rational too. It's a rather vague question, which I think is what Mr. Hitchens was saying.
Next question. Thank you.
Thanks. Both sides seem to address themselves to the rights and responsibilities of humans to each other, but there's very little said about the rights and responsibilities of humans to the environment they live in. And I think the poor record of both 19th century capitalism and modern socialism as far as the environment demonstrates that neither side has very little to offer in that area. And I'm wondering what both sides feel that their policies have to offer to those of us who are concerned about the environment.
Something? Okay. Modern capitalism has more to offer than 19th century capitalism, and to some extent more than modern socialism. So I would say, as I tried to lay out in my 8 minutes, that modern socialism, as I was trying to describe it, will itself evolve and emerge out of modern capitalism, and therefore will incorporate such of the environmental movement today as we see. So I accept your point.
Response?
If in essence the human survival, the living of human life requires to go out into the world and produce values for the sustenance of life, in a certain sense, in essence, life involves attacking the environment. That's what we're doing. So that capitalism, in essence, is a system which unleashes people's energies to go out and try to make what they can from the world, the values that human life requires. The record of productive activities, such as you were mentioning earlier, the dumping poisonous waste next door to you, etc., examples of pollution that actually do attack individuals' right to their own life, their own health, etc., are examples of the fact that the principle of human rights has not been fully understood. It was not even fully understood in 1776, and it has not been consistently applied in legal philosophy to this day. So there are a lot of problems to be dealt with, but what we first need in order to deal with those problems is an understanding of what the principle of man's rights means.
Thank you. My friend, are you here with your second question?
Yes.
All right. I would like, all right, the gentleman, we're going to go for two more questioners. My deepest apologies to those others in line. My fear is there would be people in line for a very long time, and in an effort to bring the program in at approximately 2 hours, unless either of the two gentlemen would like to defer, they'll be the last two questioners. Yes.
My question for the socialists, do you, in your opinion, was Stalin more an aberration or a product of socialist history that preceded him?
It would be true to say that you couldn't have had Stalin without Lenin. Those who make that accusation are, I would say, in an almost banal and self-evident sense, correct. It is also true that for the consolidation of his power, Stalin found it necessary to physically exterminate and liquidate what had been Lenin's Bolshevik party. Thus, I think there's no one-sided answer to that question. I think that, with the exception of the People's Republic of China, which has now embarked, it seems, on its own interpretation of the capitalist road, there is no other socialist community where the name of Joseph Stalin is regarded with anything but execration. Whether or not this is an irony, I leave it to you to decide.
Response?
No.
Right. Thank you. Final question.
My question is for the capitalist. What kind of political system would get away with welfare, since it would take the altruism of the recipients? I mean, the recipients would have to vote against cutting their own benefits, right? So how would you change the Constitution? In what way? Just a legal question.
Could you, sir, clarify the question?
Well, it seems to me that if the new system would have to get away with some civil liberties in order so that the recipients of, well, given that the population now votes half and half between getting away with the welfare and not, then the deciding factor is obviously the people that actually have welfare. Now, what kind of constitutional amendments would you suggest such that the welfare recipients would not have the civil liberty of choosing for this vote or no vote?
Okay, I think the assumption of your question is that you could not get rid of the welfare system unless you took the vote away from those who are its beneficiaries. I don't agree with that. I don't think that people vote their pocketbook. I think that if you convince people that they're better off in a different system, they'll vote for it. And as a matter of actual fact, welfare recipients are not a happy lot. And as a matter of actual fact, they would be far better off under a capitalist society. And if we could convince a majority of the electorate, including both welfare recipients and non-welfare recipients, of that simple point, then welfarism will fade away. And I don't believe that economic interests determine ideology, the other way around.
This man would have to be altruistic to give away their benefits. No more selfishness in here.
I'm saying it is not in your self-interest to be a welfare recipient. And it's pretty obvious. All you have to do is just look at them. In the main, they're a pretty mangy lot. And if you had a child, would you tell it, and suppose it could live in one of two societies. In one society half the people are on welfare, and it could qualify for welfare. In the other society, no one can qualify for welfare, but the standard of living is 10 times that of the welfare society and growing daily. Which one would you tell your child to enter? So we believe that self-interest is the interest of life, and that life is not life as a passive vegetable, but the life of productive activity. So we don't think the mere fact that someone writes you a check means that that's to your self-interest.
Thank you so much. In this final section of the debate, each side will have 4 minutes to summarize its ideas however it so chooses and however it wants to divide up that time. Mr. Judas and Mr. Hitchens will begin this process, and they will both speak for a combined total of 4 minutes.
Well, I'm still trying to figure out what the difference between us is, that is precisely, and I think I keep coming back to this point about metaphysics versus a historical view of human beings. And I think that what I find in the philosophy that I've heard tonight is what I'd call a kind of reification of capitalist man, where the traits that we associate with early capitalism of exchange, self-interested exchange, pursuit of profit, are understood in such a way as to encompass all of human nature itself, so that you get a kind of philosophy extolling selfishness. But I think that such an understanding both slights human nature and tramples upon language. As Wittgenstein used to say, language takes a holiday when you talk that way. And what we mean ordinarily by such terms as selfishness and altruism and taking care of people and loving each other and being worried about the others besides ourselves become lost. Point number 2. I don't think that the objectivists, if I can call you that, have much to offer society today. It's hard for me to find even grounds for debate between you, since your proposals, as far as I can see, would in effect take us, if they were successful, take us back to the early 19th century. And I simply don't think it's possible. I think that I think that your philosophy is hopelessly utopian.
I think I'll just close by insisting on a point we've both made in different ways. We regard capitalism as a system, not as an idea, and therefore as something that is a proper study of analysis of history and of economics, as well as of that of political competing ideology. That is, I think, that is the insight that the objectivists deny themselves, and end up with the, I would have thought, superfluous injunction to humans to be self-interested, an injunction that does not seem, as one looks around, to be very much needed. An idea that doesn't appear to require an enormous amount of reinforcement, though it might, some think, require more justification than it's had this evening. Capitalism as a system has coexisted with, and on occasion sponsored, feudalism, monarchy, fascism, slavery, apartheid, and underdevelopment. It has also been the great engine of progress, development, and innovation in a certain few heartland countries. This means that it must be a system, studied as a system, and not as an idea. Its claims to be the sponsor of freedom are purely contingent. It's good propaganda, but it's not very good political science. In the same way, those of us who take and hold to the socialist view in this century are perfectly well aware of the appalling crimes and failures, as well as of the defeats that our movement is associated with. My final submission, I think, would be that no one bothers to counterfeit a bad currency, and that the claim of so many people who don't deserve it to the socialist title gives one hope for a more enlightened application of the idea in the non-capitalist future.
I just want to briefly remark on the level we're getting down to is now metaphysical and epistemological, which is very good. It's a good sign. The earlier statement, now reiterated by Mr. Hitchens, that he's not a determinist, seems to fly in the face of what he just said, which I take as strict determinism. It does not cease to be determinism if you say man makes history, and then add to it, of course, what he makes of history, he had to make of history. Determinism is precisely that view, that human actions certainly have effects, but determinism claims that the causes are necessary so that in a certain situation only one result is possible. If you're here tonight, determinism says you had to be. We assert free will. We assert that you have particularly the free will to use your mind to think for yourself or not, and that's why we reject the entire methodology of the socialist side in this debate, the idea of historical analysis, that capitalism is not an idea, and so forth. It's basically an issue of free will versus determinism.
In my concluding remarks, I'd like to address two things said by Mr. Judas. The first was that objectivism hasn't much to offer society today. It's hopelessly utopian. Literal meaning of utopian means no place. It is not of this reality. Well, in fact, we have been arguing that it is the socialist ideas that are not of this reality. We are trying to argue that capitalism is a social system that is required by the actual, real nature of man, and hardly hopelessly utopian. It is, in fact, of tremendously practical importance that men come to understand their social requirements. I would also like to say that I hope objectivism has a lot to offer society today, because in the absence of that, I have a very bleak view of what the future will be. I also want to address the question of still trying to figure out what is the difference between us. Well, I'll tell you what the difference is between us. In essence, the difference between us is the difference between the Enlightenment and the 19th century German Romanticism. Ideas matter. Ideas determine the course of human affairs. This country is the product of a certain set of ideas. It is the product of the 18th century Enlightenment ideas. I love this country. I'm not from this country. I'm a Canadian, but I love this country, and I love the values that it stands for. I love the Statue of Liberty and the Declaration of Rights and Disneyland and the Constitution and everything that's unique about America, which is actually the product of the best attempt so far to adopt a philosophical outlook which the Enlightenment stands for. The philosophy of Aristotle, of Locke, of Cicero, the philosophy of man's natural rights. And that's where we stand. Where they stand is with the philosophy of Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Marx, the British Fabian socialists. It's a completely different tradition. It's a European tradition of thought. Now, the fact of the matter is that these two philosophical traditions are at opposite ends to each other. They're at direct odds with each other. And one of these systems, at least, is false. So I'd like to conclude by saying that the benefit to man of discovering true ideas and following them is legion. And this country and its greatness is an example of what can happen if you just approximately discover some true ideas. But the damage and destruction to man of discovering false ideas is also legion. And you have two sets of ideas up before you tonight, and it's now up to you to decide which set of ideas deserve your allegiance. Thank you.
I'm certain your applause are on behalf of all the participants. The participants, and most particularly the Objectivist Club, would like to thank you for your forbearance and your patience and your enthusiasm this evening. I think a fair plate of intellectual nourishment has been served up. To complement that plate and perhaps soothe your thirsts, if you would please join us in room 501 of the Marvin Center, we would look forward to engaging you in discussion. Thank you so much.
Well chaired, well chaired. I must have a pee. You won't leave. Where is the Marvin Center? I'll be back in 2 seconds. Great.
I guess we'll see you out here now.
But she got the, she got
Was it great? She said that she didn't know.